Welcome to Coffee Break Philosophy. I'm Christian, and today I'm particularly excited for this video. I've been looking forward to it for quite some time now because J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is one of my favorite works of all time, and it's full of Christian symbolism. Tolkien was a devout Christian but wasn't a fan of direct allegory, so finding the religious themes in the Lord of the Rings takes quite a bit of digging and thinking. Nonetheless, the symbolism is deeply intertwined into the story of the Lord of the Rings. That said, there's a wide range of symbolic elements in The Lord of the Rings which I can't fully cover in just one video, so today we're going to focus primarily on the figure of Christ in The Lord of the Rings. The director Peter Jackson even kept some quite obscure Christian references in the movies as well. Coming up, Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings. Throughout the Old Testament, priests, prophets, and kings turn up again and again as important players in the biblical stories. In the Christian tradition, Christ is understood to hold what is called the threefold office, which describes Christ as having three simultaneous characters in a sense, namely priest, prophet, and king, as we just mentioned. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus displays these aspects in various ways. The priest is associated with sacrifice, as Jesus was sacrifice for the atonement of sins in the Gospels. And this sacrifice is what replaced the old animal sacrifices, often performed by priests in the Old Testament. The prophet aspect is a more obvious one, as Jesus foretold his own persecution as well as the persecution of his disciples. The idea of Christ as king was also apparent, as he was so ironically crowned the king of the Jews. In The Lord of the Rings, no one character fully embodies Jesus Christ. Instead, the characters of Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn together embody Christ in his aspects of priest, prophet, and king, respectively. First, let's talk about Frodo. He's a hobbit and the main protagonist of The Lord of the Rings. Now, Frodo is the priest-like aspect of Christ because his story is entirely one of sacrifice. He leaves the comfort and safety of the Shire into a year-long journey through danger and increasing pain from an injury he sustained early on from the ring race on Weathertop. Christ was often described as both a lion and a lamb. The lamb, as we recall, was often the subject of the sacrifices in the Old Testament. Frodo is the lamb aspect of Christ because hobbits in general are peaceful, quiet, gentle creatures, but more importantly because Frodo endured the greatest sacrifice of the Fellowship. He willingly carried the burden of the One Ring, which represents the burden of the world's sin that Christ took up. He also sustained wounds that didn't quite heal throughout the entirety of his life, causing him to eventually leave Middle-earth for the Grey Havens, which is also pointing to and alluding to Christ's ascension rather than natural death here on Earth. Our main Hobbit protagonist also goes through a Christ-like death and rebirth experience, as all three figures of the Lord of the Rings will do, as we'll see. Frodo experiences death and rebirth in two important ways. First, in Shelob's lair, where he's effectively tranquilized and even wrapped into a giant spider's web, which looks eerily like burial wrappings that someone like Jesus would have been buried in. The second death and rebirth experience of Frodo is more subtle. He enters into Mordor to destroy the ring and emerges. This mirrors what is called the harrowing of hell, an integral part of the Christian faith as mentioned in the Apostles' Creed. It's the descent of Christ into hell, or Hades, after the crucifixion, and here Mordor is clearly depicting hell. Christ has taken upon the sins of the world just as Frodo has taken upon the burden of the ring, and both emerge victorious, Christ from the dead and Frodo from Mordor. Lastly, Frodo was not a warrior. The Jewish people expected the Messiah to be a conqueror or political leader that would set Israel free. Instead, Jesus of Nazareth was quite something different entirely. Likewise, Frodo was just a hobbit, the smallest of all, not a great elven warlord or king among men. Next, Gandalf, who goes by many names, clearly serves the role of the prophet, which is primarily a role of knowledge. Gandalf demonstrates prophetic characteristics throughout The Lord of the Rings. He knows the ancient histories of Middle-earth, he knows its deepest mystical elements, and he has some ability to see both present and future events. He often dreams or envisions aspects of the darkness growing in Mordor, for example. Another more surface level point of similarity between Gandalf and Jesus is that they essentially both work miracles. Jesus through his nature as God incarnate, and Gandalf through, well, magic. But magic and miracles might as well just be the same thing. And Gandalf, like Christ, was sent to Earth with a purpose, namely to help Middle-earth in its struggle with evil. Gandalf's death and rebirth is the most straightforward, as he literally dies in the story and returns as Gandalf the White. But the death and rebirth nature of Gandalf is also alluded to in the Battle of Helm's Deep, when Gandalf leaves the Fellowship and the people of Rohan as the armies of Saruman approach to find aid. Gandalf promises to return on the 5th day, just as Christ promised to return on the 3rd day after the crucifixion, which he stated through allegory. As an aside, note how in this part of the movie, Aragorn demonstrates his faith that Gandalf will indeed return on the 5th day by convincing King Theoden, when all seemed hopeless, to ride out and meet the enemy, betting that Gandalf would indeed return at the dawn of the 5th day, as promised. Lastly is the quite obscure reference kept in the movie, which ended up being one of my favorite scenes throughout all the films. While confronting the Balrog, Gandalf reveals himself as a servant of the secret fire.
I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor.
And a secret fire, or holy fire, is actually an old reference to the Holy Spirit. So much for Tolkien's book not being an explicitly religious work. Last is Aragorn, a man and skillful ranger who appears early in the tale. Aragorn embodies Christ through many ways in the aspect of the king. Aragorn's earlier life was quite humble. He was royalty among common folk. Jesus was also from humble origins, being born in a manger, raised as a carpenter, and spending most of his time among common people. Indeed, Aragorn is a humble king as well. One of my favorite scenes in all the movies is when Aragorn was just recently crowned, and he bows to the smallest of them all, to his friends the hobbits. Christ did the same, best exemplified by when he washed the feet of his disciples as a servant, though he was king and son of God. Aragorn was a king among common folk, and Jesus was God among men. Aragorn undergoes his death and rebirth experience in a less direct way than Gandalf and Frodo did. He very symbolically descends into the halls of the dead, a clear pointer toward Christ's descent into hell after the crucifixion, as we've already mentioned for Frodo. And while in the halls of the dead, Aragorn by his lineage demonstrates his command of the dead, the literal ghosts of the warriors past. It's here that Aragorn proves his lordship over the dead. Likewise, Christ showed his power over death itself when he walked out of the tomb. Aragorn was also greatly despised by the upper class, best exemplified by Denethor, because Aragorn was a direct threat to his interim lordship over Gondor. And in the Gospels, the elites, mostly consisting of the high priests, despised Jesus because he threatened their power as well. Another point worthy of note is to look at the lineages of Aragorn and Jesus. Aragorn is the rightful heir to the throne of Gondor because he came from the line of Isildur, so he's of a notable lineage. Likewise, Jesus had notable lineage as he came from the line of David. Then we can return to the concept of Christ as a lion and a lamb. Now, if Frodo is the lamb-like aspect of Christ, then Aragorn is clearly the lion-like aspect of Christ, as he's a fearless and skilled warrior that ends up as king and leads Gondor in the final fight against Sauron. This might just be mirroring that aspect of Christ which comes out in Revelations, when Christ leads his army in the final battle against Satan and all evil. So this sums up how Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn together represent Christ through the threefold office of priest, prophet, and king. As mentioned, and as you can clearly see, Tolkien was no fan of direct allegory, instead choosing to intersperse elements of Christianity throughout The Lord of the Rings. In fact, he only meant it as an innate religious work, though he admitted afterward that it came out explicitly religious in his opinion. If you haven't seen or read The Lord of the Rings, after this video check out the link in the description below and go read and watch it for yourself. And keep a lookout for these symbolic elements and many others, which I'll expand upon in future videos, in the people, places, and things throughout the stories. If you enjoyed this analysis of the symbols, particularly of the Christ figures in The Lord of the Rings, great. Subscribe and give it a thumbs up, but especially let me know what other symbols you've picked out from the books or movies in the comments section below so that we can talk about them in future videos. Thanks.